Welcome to the Thriving Farmer Podcast. I'm your host, Michael Kilpatrick. Our mission is to inspire, educate, and celebrate sustainable farming. We believe that you can build a profitable, sustainable farm that gives you true farm freedom. Join us as we talk to farmers, innovators, educators, and entrepreneurs to glean their top takeaways in business and life. This episode is brought to you by Orisha. Stop interruptions and focus on what matters most. Delegate repetitive duties in your tunnel to Orisha. Sleep better knowing that they'll call you if anything goes wrong in your greenhouse. Be sure to check out their homepage for useful advice on how to simplify your farm life. Orisha, that is ORISHA.io.
Farmers, do you want to see weeding tools before you buy them? Learn how to adjust cultivators in the field? Meet farmers from all over the country and see what's new in weeding tools. Then make plans today to attend the Midwest Mechanical Weed Control Field Day, September 11th at Purdue's Horticultural Research Farm in Lafayette, Indiana. At this full-day event, you'll see weeding tool demos of all scales in beets, cabbage, and corn. Everything from hand tools to two-wheel tractors, cultivating tractors, up to large row crop tractors. The morning trade show and education sessions are a great time to learn more and brush up your skills. Lunch is a great time to meet farmers from all over the country. And in the afternoon, the field demos of all scales will keep you interested and give you plenty to talk about and think about on the way home. That's the Midwest Mechanical Weed Control Field Day, September 11th in Lafayette, Indiana. You can find it by Googling Midwest Mechanical Weed Control Field Day or go to thelandconnection.org. See you there.
Hey, Thriving Farmers, Michael Kilpatrick here with yet another episode of the Thriving Farmer Podcast. And today we're joined by Sam Tilton, who is the organizer of the annual Midwest Mechanical Weed Control Field Day. After earning his master's degree in horticulture from Michigan State, Sam has worked many roles in vegetable farming, from tool development to teaching on sustainable horticulture. His diverse background and passion for plants have shaped his expertise in the field. Sam, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much. Happy to be here. Appreciate you having me, Michael.
Yeah, and I was able to come to your last field day, and that was a lot of fun. I think the highlight was the robot tractor literally kind of blowing up on us.
Yeah, well, that was not my highlight, but I'm glad people enjoyed that anyway.
But no, it was fabulous. There was so many different manufacturers there. So many different tools shown. It was a great setup. They had crops in the field. They could actually demo everything from different robot weeders that didn't blow up to, old style cultivators. So yeah, it was, if you were interested in mechanical cultivation, it's the place to be. And you guys do have another one coming up too, correct?
Yeah, that's right. Wednesday, September 11th at the Purdue Horticulture Farm in Lafayette, Indiana.
Okay, awesome. So yeah, folks, makes a note of that. We'll circle back to that at the end. But today we wanted to chat about transplants, because many times you can do all the cultivation you want to in the field, but if you don't have a good transplant, if you're sticking a transplant in the ground and that transplant's very weak, you're gonna have a much harder time getting that to grow well for you in the field. So let's first kind of talk about, what are transplants and why would someone want that over direct seeding?
Yeah, it's, like a lot of things in life or farming, it's an interesting balance. So on the one hand, transplants give you a leg up in the field for maybe two reasons. One is that in terms of weed control, what I always tell people, rule of thumb for weed control, you got to have your crop bigger than the weeds. And that can be a lot harder when you're direct seeding a carrot than when you're plopping a 4-inch tall cabbage transplant into the ground. So one thing is that kind of by definition, transplants are keeping you ahead of the weeds, and almost universally a transplant is going to be easier to keep weeded than something that's direct seeded. So that's number one. The second thing is there's some plant health to be gained from direct seeding, especially for things with a taproot like carrots and whatnot. But especially in organic farming, where we're more limited in the chemical controls we can use, transplants offer more security that the plants you're putting out in the field are going to grow. So of course it'll still happen. You can do a transplant session and a lot of things won't take, but in general, it's much more common when you're direct seeding beets, carrots, that there's a fungus in the soil, that something else went wrong, the soil's too wet, etc. where you're going to see a spotty stand, and it's more common when you're transplanting that you're just sure of a good stand. So
Hmm.
there's a lot of benefits, but like I say, it's all a balance. The drawback is it's way more money and labor to grow the transplants in the greenhouse and transplant them in the field. So, it's just a balance of how much resources you can put towards transplanting and what you choose to transplant.
Hmm. Absolutely. Okay, and so you've mentioned a couple things that you typically direct seed: carrots, beets. You've mentioned some things which we typically transplant: cabbage, squash. What other things are common transplants?
Sure. So common transplants generally are either vegetables that have a longer season, like squash, tomatoes, things like that, um, or that aren't as vigorous growers. So, for example, a lot of people will transplant watermelon. There's a lot of things that can go wrong with watermelon, whereas storage squash, they're just a little more vigorous in general. So, one other thing with transplants, I should say, is another reason they reduce risk is it's less time in the field, right? And so you can control the conditions in a greenhouse much more securely than you can the weather in your field. And so if you've got, say, a head lettuce that's going to be, I don't know, say 60 days from seed maybe to a harvested head out into the field, you would much rather oftentimes start that head lettuce in the greenhouse, put that out there as a transplant, and only wait maybe 4 weeks until it sizes up. So there's a lot of traditional crops that people transplant. But the other thing that's been really fun and I might say kind of revolutionary in the last few years of vegetable growing is the paper pot transplanter. And I just bring that up now because it allows you to not touch individual transplants when you're planting them and use a lot smaller cells. Growers are now transplanting things that we really wouldn't think of transplanting in the past, like beets, cilantro, salad turnips, spinach, and especially for, say, production in an unheated hoop house, again, where that space is super high value, you really want to bring crops to maturity fast. And so, kind of less traditional crops people can still consider for transplanting in the paper pot system.
Yeah, I'm always shocked when I see some southern growers. I've seen them to do like tomatoes direct seed or like okra direct seed, and that's something always we typically do as a transplant. But going back to that paper pot, that does give you a way better things of doing some of the things more that are more unusual.
Yeah, and that's a good point. I guess I should just say at the outset, I'm from Wisconsin. I farm in Wisconsin. I went to school in Michigan. I live in Minnesota now. I'm a upper Midwest boy. So, right, everything I'm thinking is I'm not thinking about you people in the South, so I'm sorry.
But I think that's point that yes, you could, but if you're trying to again control those weeds, it does make way more sense to stick a 4-inch tomato transplant in the ground than to stick a seed in the ground. And then there's obviously a few crops we probably would never transplant. I mean, like carrots is really tough. Parsnips, I think, would almost be impossible. Any other ones that you
Mhm.
think are just impossible?
I would say those are the big ones, the crops with tap roots. Although because they want to get established directly in the soil. I will say though, in horticulture, there's a lot of rules of thumb, but there's few hard and fast rules. I've got friends who are transplanting carrots and radishes with the paper pot transplanter into the hoop house. So just not to say it maybe always makes sense, but it's possible to try new stuff out.
Yeah, I have heard the carrot thing. It's interesting. Yeah, I mean, I can see it. It's just you have to have. I think you have to have the perfect conditions to make that work well.
Hmm.
Yeah. All right. So let's talk about like varieties. I mean, I'm assuming varieties are pretty subjective, but I do know, like, I think the only crop that I've heard of, and maybe you have some other experience here, is that some spinach varieties do not transplant as well as other ones. But are you any other crops or varieties that you know or that you should pick versus others?
No, a lot of times because the conditions in the greenhouse are hopefully so much preferable to the field, when we're thinking about variety characteristics, we're really thinking about, field performance, kind of disease resistance, the growth habit, flavor, how your market's going to find it. But yeah, I'm not used to thinking a lot about greenhouse growing when picking a variety.
Okay, gotcha. And then timing and schedule. So let's start talking a little bit about that as like when to transplant.
Yeah, so let's see. First thing is, it's always helpful, I think, to start with your harvest date because at the end of the day, usually whether it's a flower or a vegetable, you're trying to plan your production and you want to harvest on a specific day. And so, what can be helpful is to pick your harvest day and then move backwards. And so, let's just use a tomato as say our example. So you've got your date that you want to harvest, and then you know the days to maturity of that tomato. Okay, and so you can guess what time of the year it needs to go in the ground. And then there's all sorts of rules of thumb on how old your transplants need to be. And you can go to your extension service or Johnny Seeds or all sorts of different places, and also your just own experience. But so my rule of thumb for a tomato transplant, I want it to be 6 weeks old between when I put the seed in the ground and when I put it out in the field. So I've got my harvest date. I work back by days to maturity to transplant date, and then I work back 6 weeks to when I'm going to seed that. And um, I think, as vegetable growers, I think we always want to push the season and get things in the earliest we can or the latest we can. And I think a good piece of advice is feel free to do that as much as you want, always be experimenting, but don't really push your main crop. Whether that's tomatoes or carrots, whatever that is, be planting early carrots, be planting late carrots, but the bulk of your crop plant when that vegetable actually grows well. Yeah, and you don't want to be kind of experimenting with that. And the other thing I would add for scheduling is deciding how much to plant. And one thing I'm a big believer in, what I call as a safety factor. So, for example, let's say I'm transplanting my tomatoes and I've got them all out there. I don't think there's really going to be a time where every single tomato transplant looks good. I always want to have maybe 5 to 10% extra so that I can choose the best ones. And then similarly, when I plant my tomato seeds, I like to think I'm good, but I'm not that good, and I'm not always going to have 100% germination and every single seed I plant turn into a great transplant. So at every step along the way when I'm scheduling, I add in a safety factor so I'm always overproducing a little bit. And then, the more experience you get and the better you become as a greenhouse grower, you can shrink that safety factor over time.
Hmm. Well, and two, I mean, and again, you never know if it's, God forbid, a hailstorm. I think more common is the vole or something that goes in the greenhouse and takes in a couple of transplants. So having that safety factor too to replace plants. I always remember, and my mentors, they always had one bench in the greenhouse that had a whole bunch of old transplants on it. And I could never really,
Uh,
and that was the reason, in case something happened. They just had, why would throw them away? It just takes one extra minute every day to water them. So,
yeah, that's a great point. And some growers, they'll transplant a week later, you'll see what didn't take, and you'll have someone just walk through and fill in those gaps similarly.
yeah, yeah. All right. So then seeds. I know seeds is important.
Yeah. Uh, Boy, let's see, I think this is one of those things where you could go off the deep end thinking about details because it's so important. And at the same time, there's just some like basic things to think about. Um, I would boil it down to good seed has a high germination percentage and high vigor. And if we took a second to think about that, germination percentage is what percentage of those seeds are going to pop up given ideal conditions. Okay. And vigor is kind of how strong those seeds are. So, for example, you could have two trays of different tomato varieties right next to each other. Maybe they were quality seed and you gave them a great head start growing, 100% germination, but you'll see different levels of vigor. So, one tray after whatever 2 weeks, the plants might be 2 inches tall, and the other tray only a week tall. And that comes from what you can think of as kind of epigenetics, like how, first of all, how strong is that variety, and also how healthy was that mother plant in laying that seed. So high germination percentage and vigor. And then if you kind of want to protect those, if you get good seed, you got to be thinking about how old is it and what are the storage conditions. So there's certain varieties where the germination percentage just goes down pretty quickly naturally over time. So that would be things like parsnip, that would be things like cilantro, and that just has to do with the personality of that vegetable. And so there's some seeds where the best practice is just not to plant old seed because it's not, in terms of the price of the seed, it's not worth missing out on a seeding that doesn't come up. And then in the storage conditions. So if you're saving your own seed, a good rule of thumb is just an old refrigerator. You can always do better because they can get a little high in humidity, but you want to keep it cool, you want to keep it dark, and you want to keep it dry. And so I've seen a lot of growers get by, fine enough with an old refrigerator in the barn.
Yeah, and we have an old fridge freezer, and so we typically put the tomatoes, peppers, and the stuff we get out of the freezer out once a year in the freezer, and then we keep the stuff more common that we use in the fridge below it. I don't know if that means anything, but that was kind of our reasoning.
Oh
That if you
yeah.
pull it out,
Another thing to keep in mind in terms of fridge and freezer is temperature changes. So what seeds
hmm
don't want, they don't want to be, let's say you save your own seed or you get them from the catalog, whatever. You don't want to pop them right into the freezer, right? That's a huge temperature change. Or same thing, you don't want to take
okay,
them out of the freezer, seed them in the greenhouse, and pop them back into the freezer. So it's nice to either put them in the fridge first and then drop them down, but just in general, they don't respond as well to temperature changes that are real big.
good point there. I didn't think of that. So yeah, gradual change. So we have to realize that these are actual living organisms.
Yeah, and I think we'll talk about this shortly when we talk about germination. So I'll just give a prelude here, but seeds are very smart. They can sense their environment, and they'll
hmm
also die in response to poor environments. So we'll talk about that more later, but just to say all the different environmental factors are going to affect that seed.
And then, do you do any germ testing when you get seeds in, or do you just usually rely on the company?
I don't do germ testing unless there's a concern. So to me, that's one of the good things about working with a reputable company. I think most of the listeners on your podcast, or a lot of them, are making their living of some kind from farming. And I feel like, just like a carpenter's not going to go and get some really cheap tools and expect to do a good job, the seeds that you're getting on a hardware store rack, you can imagine how they were stored. You can imagine the clerk there didn't listen to us on this podcast, right? So that's fine for home gardeners, but in terms of trying to make a living, you really want to buy from a reputable source. And all the reputable sources that I know, part of the reason that they're reputable is they provide certain information with the seed. And that would be things like germination percentage. So if it's not stamped on the packet, there should be a lot number. And that means you can call the seed rep and they'll have that on file. And the other nice thing about the lot number is if there's any issues with disease or lack of vigor in the field, that's a way to track that. And so if you call up your seed rep and describe the problem, they should be able to say, oh, yeah, that lot number, we had problems with XYZ. And I guess that's a good piece of information that I was given, I think, is really develop a relationship with your seed rep because it pays off in a lot of ways.
Yeah, recently we had a lot of beans, and I just was able to call the company up and say, "Hey, this lot," and I sent a picture of the field, and thankfully I had two varieties next to each other, and one was just beautiful, perfect, and the other one was like these big skips and stuff, and they with the lot number, yep, bad lot, here you go, replacement. So,
Mhm.
absolutely makes sense there. Let's talk a little bit about. All right, so we've talked about good seeds. What about seed starting mix? Give us your advice there.
I would echo again, kind of think of yourself as a professional. And what I mean is, um, don't I would really caution people against making their own potting soils. I think, especially in the organic movement, we all want to do everything for ourselves, which is fantastic. That's one of the things I love about it. But also realize that we live in a connected economy and we can't be experts at everything. And so, in my opinion, it's pretty much always worth buying premixed potting soil from a company that does it for a living. The big reasons are that they're testing all the time, and they're testing all the different components. And they're testing all the different parts of the mix coming in. So that's one thing. If I could give just a little bit of history, I'm a big fan of horticultural history. And I think it's fun and maybe helpful for people to know that the peat-based mixes that are ubiquitous for us are newer. They weren't around before the 1960s. And the way that farmers used to make their potting soil was one-third sand, one-third compost, and one-third turf loam, or when they had rotted down or composted turf. And so that was a potting soil, and that was okay. But the issues with that type of potting soil is one, consistency, right? What we want in farming and everything is consistency, right? We love Ben Hartman's book. Every carrot seed I put in the ground, I want to pull out and turn into $1. And if it's not consistent, I'm having waste, right? So one of the issues when you make your own potting soil is it's not consistent, and so you're not getting consistent results. And so Cornell University in 1960 came up with the soilless mix. And you kind of think, well, how's it soilless? It's potting soil. But what they mean is it doesn't have field soil in it. And so that's a huge source of variability, can be a huge source of disease. And so what's really gained popularity since Cornell came up with it are these peat-based mixes. And so that's pretty much what everyone is using, are these soilless peat-based mixes. And what we like about them is they're more uniform in physical properties, they're more uniform in chemical properties, they're more disease-free. In terms of our wear and tear in our bodies, they're lighter than soil. It's easier to influence the chemical properties in peat-based mixes. So that's really what people tend to use.
Absolutely. And I mean, I know there's all different additions now. They're doing a core and they're doing other things like that. And I think those are all fine. But I think that original mix that Cornell did, which is peat, perlite, and I think some lime. I think that was the original mix, 3 ingredients. That still to this day, there's some growers that swear by that. I really like a compost-based mix. I think that adds a significant amount of life to the soil.
Hmm. Could I say a few words about the physical characteristics of the mix?
Sure, go for it.
I tend to think of the world in kind of black and white and balances and things balancing out, like we were saying about why to grow transplants or not. And so, in a greenhouse potting mix, what you're really asking for, what the experts say, is you want 2 things out of that mix, okay, which are kind of contradictory. One is you want porosity. You want a lot of air-filled pore space, right? Roots are like us. They breathe, and we want air-filled pore space for those roots to breathe. Okay. And we also want water holding capacity. We want those pores to hold water because we don't want to be watering every 2 hours or something. So on the one hand, we want our mix to hold air, and on the other hand, we want it to hold water. And you can see how in most ways those are kind of opposites, but that's why we love these materials like peat, like core, sometimes like shredded bark. We're trying to get materials that have this nice balance of holding air and also holding water. And then the other thing you'll notice with mixes is the companies will vary the particle size because the particle size is going to dictate how much capillarity that potting soil has, how much it's going to raise water up. And how much drainage it's going to have. So, for example, if you buy a specialized germination mix, you'll notice that the particles are very fine, they're very small. And why is that? Because then the soil particles are small. It's going to hold more water, which is really important for germination. However, when I'm growing perennials in like 1-quart pots, then they'll sell you a mix that has a lot more bark and a lot more bigger particles because there we're more concerned about drainage. When it rains outside, we want that water to run through. So just to say, those are some of the physical characteristics that we're thinking about with a potting soil.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And then fertility is important too, especially with the germination mixes. You have to have your salts low enough so that the seeds will germinate. But as your plant grows, you probably need to be able to add higher levels of that. Some forms of nitrogen are salt based. Many of the ones that we use, and so you need to be able to kind of push that up as that plant matures to get more fertility to it.
Yeah, and I think we'll talk about it a little later in terms of supplemental fertility. I would say most growers seem happy with compost-based peat mixes. Things like Vermont Compost or Cosmo, Purple Claw, all the great companies that are out there. And those are still peat-based mixes that perform physically like a peat-based mix, but they have compost in it. And usually, not always, but usually that's enough nutrition to get transplants, all the way through. But really good point. That's another reason I caution people against making their own mixes, because if you get the fertility wrong, you can have problems with germination.
Absolutely. Hey farmers, irrigation in your tunnels and greenhouses is so important. And joining me is Guillaume from Orisha to talk about why.
Yeah. First reason you want to take care of your irrigation is consistency. You want to have harvest predictable. Second reason, you want to prevent disease and deficiencies. So first disease you can get is all the rotting in the soil, all the root rots. And there are other problems like sclerotinia, where the wet soil is just causing still fungal problem to your plant.
Yeah. And I think it's important to point out here that for most folks, we were recommending drip tape versus overhead irrigation to start off with.
Yeah.
Yeah, because you want to keep those plants as dry as possible, even while you do need to keep the root zone with some water in it. And talk about frequency of watering. I think that's something that a lot of people don't quite understand.
Yeah, first, for the plant, we want to keep them as dry as possible, but for the soil as well. We want the soil as dry as possible while providing enough water for the plant to transpire. And the plant doesn't transpire during the night. So when the sun is not there, we don't irrigate, first rule. Second rule, we want to give small batch of water. And that gets hard if you do it manually. So you want to find some kind of automation that will do it for you so that you can stay focused on the other part of the farm. And the idea is just to not overwater anytime. And we realize that most farmer tends to overwater because they're afraid that their plants are going to wilt or something.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. To find out more about Orisha, including their popular leasing option with no upfront costs, go to orisha.io. That is ORISHA.io. Also, download their free guide, Maximizing Your Greenhouse Income, at the website, orisha.io. All right, so sowing or containers and equipment. Let's talk kind of like, okay, what are you going to put your seeds in?
Sure. So I guess probably the first question for most people is container size. We could, talk about that for a whole podcast or something. But I think the thing to know is, like most things, there's industry standards or rules of thumb that tend to work out fine. And if you want to really dial it in, you can. So most farms that I visit, they'll have maybe at least three main sizes. So I'm sorry, let me back up. We call the size of our trays 10-20 trays, okay? 10 inches by 20 inches. That's the size of these trays or the size of the basket. So, for example, when you go to the greenhouse and you're buying, flowers to put in your front yard, you'll see that there's all different sizes of inserts that still fit into that same 10-20 size tray. So just to say, for the greenhouse industry, that 10-inch by 20-inch tray is kind of the industry standard, and we divide it up in all sorts of different ways to get different cell sizes. And so most farms I'm on, they'll have a 50 count cells, so those are bigger cells, to plant things that are going to grow faster, say like watermelon, cucumbers, things like that they don't want to transplant either at all or right away. They'll have a medium cell size like a 72 or a 98. And that could be for things like brassica transplants that will go straight into the field, or maybe if they want to transplant tomatoes out of that. And then they'll have a much smaller cell size, like maybe a 128 or up to 244. That either they'll plant things like tomatoes in that are going to get bumped out to a different cell tray, or things that don't need a lot of space, like say scallions or onions, things like that. And everything in the greenhouse is a balance. On the one hand, you want to give your plants as much room as possible to grow and develop healthy root systems and have the nutrition in the soil. On the other hand, we don't all have infinite greenhouse space, so you're trying to make the most use of that space. So that's kind of the balance on picking those different sizes. Most people tend to use square pots, and the reason is that they're square so they can fit in better. So say if you've got like a 4-inch pot that you're bumping up your tomatoes into, most people are using squares just because you can fit them easier and more of them into a tray. Another thing to think about are the details in the trays. So for example, there's a wonderful property of plants which we call air pruning. And so a root will not grow through air. They don't like growing through air. Duh, that's why they grow in soil. And so you might see nursery trays that have slits in the side of those containers. And those are to air prune the roots so that they don't spiral and grow along the sides and rather shoot right down. And so, for example, the wind strip trays that are really a fantastic nursery tray if you can afford the money for them, that's the principle that they work on, is they've got slits on each of the four corners and they do that air pruning. Two other things I might mention, you'll often see ribs in the cells. Those are for anti-spiraling so that the roots won't spiral, but rather they'll go down. And one other thing that I've just become a fan of lately are what they call deep cell trays or nursery trays. And I would encourage people to just to take a look at that because they don't take up any more space. They only just require more potting soil. But so for something like a 52 count tray, a 72 count tray that you're used to using for everything else, you can get it in a deep cell format, which means the cells are maybe about an inch deeper. And so the roots have that much more room to grow. There's that much more soil volume, which means there's more fertility there. It also means that they hold more moisture so they don't dry out as fast. So again, the downside is they use more soil, but other than that, in my opinion, they're great.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. All right, so we've got sowing the seeds with the equipment. Now we're into sowing, and obviously there's a lot of different ways to sow. Some of these drop seeders are pretty convenient. Some seeds are still just like always going to be hand seeded.
Yeah, I'm used to seeing maybe like kind of three-ish, four-ish different methods. So some seeds are often going to be hand seeded, whether that's because you're just doing a small amount of them, you don't have the money to invest in something yet, or they're really irregularly shaped and don't fit well into seeders. For a lot of people, the kind of first step up is going to be some sort of what I'm used to calling like a vibro wand, which almost looks like maybe a trowel with a battery that vibrates. And so it just makes it easier to singulate seed. So you're still doing it by hand, um, but a little bit easier than tap it out of the seed packet. The next step up for a lot of people is going to be a vacuum seeder. And there's a lot of different models. They connect to a vacuum, like a shop vac, and they'll seed one tray at a time. And so you'll buy different inserts. So imagine, oh, like a piece of plexiglass with the right size hole drilled in it for whatever your seed is, at the format for whatever tray size you're using. So let's say a 72. And you'll put all the seeds on that tray. You'll turn on the vacuum and it'll suck them just into the right holes. The extra seeds you'll scrape off. You'll put the insert on top of your tray. You'll turn the vacuum off and the seeds drop in. And those are only like a few $100. I think they're pretty economical for people. And that's a lot of the farms I'm on. That's pretty much the level that I'm seeing because a lot of these farms aren't running giant greenhouse operations where it pays to get more intense seeders. But some growers do love getting an old used greenhouse seeding machine, and those things can seed a flat in, I don't know, 3 seconds. They just run through on a conveyor belt. So that is an option just to know that those are out there for larger growers.
Yeah, absolutely. And then let's talk about germination conditions, because that's obviously a huge part of why we're starting in the greenhouse.
Yeah. Okay. So this is where I think it's fun to say that seeds are very intelligent. And I think about this from my work with weeding tools too, because we're always thinking about when weed seeds are germinating. But seeds are always taking the temperature, so to speak, in all different ways of their surroundings. So the big three that you want to be thinking about for germinating seeds in a greenhouse is light, oxygen, temperature, and then I would add moisture to that. Light, oxygen, temperature, moisture. But just know seeds are sensing all sorts of different things. They can sense the chemistry in the soil around them. They know the CO2 levels. They know the nitrogen levels. And they can use that and other information to know the time of year. So I know that we're talking about commercial vegetable crops here, and the reason that those crops are commercial and vegetables that they've been cultivated for hundreds or thousands of years. And so wild seeds have dormancy periods where a certain percentage of those seeds might germinate pretty quickly after their drop, but some of them won't germinate for 10, 20, 50, 500 years until their drop. So that's something to think about maybe with perennial flowers, but with our vegetables, normally the reason we're growing them is they all germinate pretty easily. And so what we want to be thinking about is light, oxygen, temperature, moisture. Um, I would say what I find growers getting to eventually after they've been growing for a few years is a germination chamber. Most people want to use a germination chamber. And there's all sorts of different ways to make it, but just think about it like an old refrigerator. Because what an old refrigerator does is it locks out light and it lets you control temperature and humidity. And so again, you can imagine making it out of plywood or old cooler panels, whatever you want. But a germination chamber is something just like a greenhouse that gives you more control over those conditions. Because what a lot of growers find is, I think the hardest property to control during germination is moisture. A lot of times things will dry out. And so, or temperature, especially if Let's say you're heating your greenhouse with forced air, maybe some things are further away, etc. For those first, maybe 5 days when seeds are germinating, you want the most even conditions possible. And so a germination chamber is, oftentimes less than a few $100. But with something like a crock pot in the bottom with a thermostat on it, you can have a nice, moist and even heat that's going to give you pretty reliable germination.
Absolutely. Yeah. And we've done a lot of old fridges. We actually used a 3-door big commercial fridge for our ginger and turmeric, just because they take so much space during germination time. But a fridge is great. I don't know about you, but I'm just not a big fan of the electric heat mats.
Oh, yeah. That's a great question. I That's a great question. The heat mats, I think the heat mats are nice if you or your employees are there consistently, and I mean like many times a day in the greenhouse. What's nice about the germination chambers is it's a little more like set it and forget it. You've got those thermostats on there, and more than even temperature, you're also controlling humidity. You can also lock out light if you need to. So yeah, just kind of more even conditions. In my basement, I use a heat mat, but I'm a plant nerd, so I'm down there all the time checking on them. It's fine, but yeah.
Yeah. And when a basement is such much more controlled circumstances or parameters than a greenhouse.
Good point. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So then getting them germinated, keeping them moist, and then care during like the growth, this weeks they're in the greenhouse. Let's talk a little bit about that.
Oh yeah. Well, maybe one more thing to say. When I was farming, I loved rules of thumb. So maybe to germinate most things, I'd put them at if it was a cooler crop at 72 for germination, if it was a warmer crop, maybe 78, and that's maybe good enough. But when I started teaching horticulture, I really wanted to give people more dialed in information. And one thing that I really found helpful are spec sheets or info sheets. And these are put out by a lot of the larger companies that sell a lot of seed to wholesale greenhouses. And these are companies like maybe Syngenta or Ball Seed. So maybe one thought there is if people are having great germination with whatever they're doing, great, no problem. But if people ever want a little more wintertime reading or really want to dial in for a certain crop, I would encourage them to look up a spec sheet for that crop, because what they do is they'll lay out for different growth stages of the crop, germination, and then plug production stage 1, 2, 3, 4. What is the time that you should expect that seed to germinate? And if it hasn't come up in so many days, you better be thinking something new. What temperature do they need? What light do they need? What moisture level? Should you be covering the seed? Anyhow, so just to say, if people want to dive in, those spec sheets can be real helpful. Next, in terms of growing a transplant, the next thing I think about is water or soil moisture. And that's because I think it's sort of the easiest one to get wrong. And it can also have big effects on your transplants. And so when we're germinating, we want to have moisture, obviously. As soon as that seed swells or imbibes water, there's no going back. If you dry out too much after that, it's dead. And so proper moisture and consistent moisture is super important through germination when you see that seed pop up. But there's a few dangers if you keep the soil too wet right after germination. One, soil that is too wet encourages hypocotyls, or just the stems of young plants, to stretch. So the moister your soil, the more you're going to have long, leggy plants that are going to flop over later. So that's one thing. Two, and the way that you water is going to direct how the roots grow. And if you keep that plug very moist, the roots are going to start by just growing along the surface and just coiling at the top. And you want to drive the roots down, right? You want a nice thick plug with deep roots. And the other thing, the whole danger with watering is disease. The more moist that we keep the soil, the more that we're inviting disease. And so a lot of growers say that we want to grow dry, which is to say, as much as we can, we want that soil to stay as dry as it can. One saying that I've heard that I really like is, we water so that the soil may dry. And what that means is a lot of people think, especially maybe home gardeners, oh, I got to be doing something for my plants. I'm going to be watering all the time. I'll keep the soil moist. But that's what kills plants. Really, what you want to do is keep the soil as dry as it can, and let the soil dry out. So water, and then wait, and don't water again until the soil has dried, not bone dry. But that's what we want to do, and that's what plants prefer, is that process of wetting and drying, and they don't want to stay wet all the time. And indeed, that kind of watering will invite disease.
Mm-hmm. So you definitely want to give them a little bit of time between waterings, let the soil dry out somewhat before you do water them again.
Yeah, I would really suggest for growers, and especially any growers with employees, to spend a little more time quantifying what watering means. Because you can imagine, if you turn to your employee and say, oh, water the greenhouse, you can't be very mad at them if with only that direction they underwater or overwater. There's a really great resource by Will Healy, Hely, who came up with different moisture levels, 1 through 5. And I'll send you a link. We can put it in the show notes or something.
Mm-hmm.
But I would really encourage people to train themselves and train their employees. And when I was at the tech college, we printed this poster off and had it in the greenhouse, water level 1 through 5, so that we could say, hey, water to a level 4. Hey, when you see the soil dry down to level 2, time to water again. And so people can just get a better feeling for what we're talking about when we say water the plants.
Mm-hmm. That's fascinating. Let's talk a little bit about like airflow, because I know that is important.
Yeah, airflow is key. Airflow is key for disease prevention. And so there's maybe 2 different types of things that I'll see growers do. One that pretty much everyone does is having circulation fans in the greenhouse, right? And your greenhouse rep, if they're good, just like your seed rep, they should be able to tell you for the square footage of your greenhouse, how many fans do you need, where should you put them, so that you're getting good circulation all the way around the greenhouse. And then realize that all these things are connected, right? So best practice is to water your plants in the morning. Why is that? Because we don't want the leaf surfaces to stay wet overnight, and the sun is what's going to dry things out. So, it's all connected in terms of improving airflow, in terms of reducing disease on leaves. How you water is going to make a difference. The other thing that some growers will do, depending on what crops they're growing, their humidity, their region, things like that, is a purge of the greenhouse. So, some growers, I think, are tempted, rightly so, in February, March, to keep the greenhouse battened up all the time to save energy. But once in a while, it's nice to open up a part of the greenhouse and do a purge and switch a lot of that air out. So those are 2 of the different strategies that I see where people are really encouraging airflow.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Talk a little bit about fertility or additional fertility.
Okay, let's talk about fertility. So first thing, if we're going to talk about fertility, in my opinion, we have to step back and talk about pH. And the reason is that, here's my fun example. I don't know if you'll think it is as fun as I do. pH, it dictates how available nutrients are for your plants. So for example, if I'm playing with hammers and I keep breaking my arm, and I go to the doctor and say, oh, god dang it, I broke my arm again, and the doctor, she keeps patching me up and sending me back out to play with hammers again, she's not really solving the problem, right? She's putting a cast on, but I'm going to go break my arm again. The problem is I got to stop playing with hammers, okay? So similarly, with pH, if our pH is too low or too high, all the nutrients in the world can be there, but chemically they'll be locked out and not be available to our plants. So that's why before talking about fertility, it's important to say the pH of your soil has to be within range, which is another reason that I do not advocate for people making their own potting soils, because you really want that pH to be correct. So that's one thing, is pH. And now while we're talking about pH, let's talk about water, okay? And it is a very good practice to test your water. You can send it in. J.R. Peters is one company I've used. I'm sure there's plenty of others. You can send your water in and get an idea of its alkalinity and its pH and dissolved salts and just what's in there. The reason that I bring that up when we're talking about fertility is this. Many of us, especially in the Midwest, but all over the country, our groundwater comes from limestone areas. The groundwater is in limestone caves. Okay, now think about that for a second. You put limestone out on your fields, don't you, to adjust the pH? Well, when it's in those underground caves, the limestone is dissolving in your water. And so you can think of it, if you have a lot of alkalinity, every time you're watering, imagine like you're just dusting a little bit of salt, a little bit of lime on your plants. Yeah. And so over time, if the pH of your water is that off, you can be almost applying lime every time you water. And so some growers will have an issue. Oh, I've got a nutritional deficiency, and we'll look, and the pH is way off. And so it's not really a deficiency, right? The problem is that they were playing with hammers, so to speak. And so we got to solve the real problem, which is the pH. And so if you know the pH of your water, you can start to do things to mitigate that. Okay, so now I'm going to answer your first question about fertility, but just to say, if we're going to be honest, we got to talk about pH first. Okay, so if we're talking organic production, then we've got two-ish options that are also available to conventional growers, but you'll see how they're different. Okay, one is amendments that we incorporate into our soil at planting. And so for a lot of these professional compost-based soilless mixes like Vermont compost, Purple Cow, all the great ones, they are hopefully including a nutrient charge that will get most plants through till they're out of the greenhouse and in the field. Okay, and so a lot of growers don't plan on supplemental fertilization. Okay, or if they do, like I used to do at the tech college, I loved incorporating rock dust and vermicompost, and so we had a little cement mixer, and we'd mix those into the soil before we planted. So that's great, bone meal, whatever you want to do. The other option that's a lot of fun is a fertilizer injector. And that is something that plugs into your water line, plumb into your water line, and so that the water passes through the fertilizer injector, sucks up a known quantity of that stock solution, and you can set that whether it's half a percentage, 1, 2, 3% of that stock solution, and puts it into your hose. And so you can imagine that the power that gives you to really dial in exactly what you're adding to your plants. And so conventional growers have all types of water-soluble chemicals they can use in a fertilizer injector, but organic growers also have water-soluble, usually it's a nitrogen source that we want, that we can apply through the fertilizer injector. The other thing that can be nice about that, the fertilizer injector, is if you are having a pH problem, you can buy materials like flowable lime, or other things that you can put through that water too. So a fertilizer injector can be a good way that either if you need to add fertility or you think you might want to, it gives you that flexibility, and you can add it at different rates at any time during the growth period.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And to your water kind of advice there, we have really super high bicarbonate. So we do have a high pH, but we have high nitrate. Our water's really rough. So there's a lot that we're doing to our water to try to get it cleaned up before we start pumping it all over the farm, but it still causes major issues.
Yeah, maybe one thing to say with nutrition, I think we have a lot of holy grails in organic farming because we're also idealistic. That's why we got into it. I think to a certain extent, no-till is a holy grail, which is to say it's super great, but I think sometimes people go overboard and make the perfect the enemy of the good. And I think similarly that can happen sometimes with fertility, where we think, I'm going to provide, the maximum, best, incredible fertility ever. And you can go too much. So not necessarily where you have a toxicity, but, sure, you can add way too much and your plant leaves start yellowing or something worse. But you can also just have plants that are too big and floppy. And the more nitrogen in a plant, the more attractive it is to insects. So just know that it can be too much of a good thing. At the end of the day, you want a healthy transplant that usually is pretty stocky. You want it to be really strong and resist the flopping around during transplanting. So don't go overboard on fertility. Remember, the ultimate goal is a healthy transplant. It's not, a 5-foot tall tomato or something crazy.
Yeah, absolutely. Talk a little bit about like thinning, pricking out, bumping up that, because for us, like we start our tomatoes in 20 row cell trays, and then we'll go into like a 4-inch pot. I know a lot of people just do those in like a maybe a 200 cell count and then go to a 4-inch pot.
Yeah, I think a lot of it is what growers are comfortable with. I've never seeded into open trays, but I was on Elliot Coleman's farm, or plenty of great growers who do that. So I think a lot of it's personal preference. Um, I think a big thing for pricking out is plan to do it for the crops that need it. Like tomatoes, if you're going to bump them up, maybe cucumbers, but realize how much labor that takes. So for something like maybe brassicas or onions, you really don't want to be pricking those out. If you're pricking those out, what that means is that there was a mistake made in seeding and they were seeded too densely. So if you need to do it that time, great, but work your way back to the process, because ultimately, just like for me when I was growing carrots, if I seed them too densely, it doesn't pay to go by hand and thin, multiple beds of carrots. You really got to dial in your seeder so that you're seeding them at the right density. Um, then the other thing is kind of know the personality of your crop as much as you can. And this is where I think either your seed reps or those spec sheets can be helpful. Something like a tomato, as deeply as you can bury that in that new pot, it's going to set out a lot more roots. Whereas the rule of thumb for most things is always maintain, the soil level where it was. And so the more that you can get to know that plant kind of personality when you repot it, you can get it off to a good start.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then for us, we actually find like a utensil or something. So we'll actually use like a pencil and the eraser end of a pencil for pricking out. That's kind of what we find works best, because it helps, move those roots around without being too rough on them.
Yeah, there's some I don't know what we call these. One a Springdale farmer I used to work, Peter made kind of templates of plywood the size of a 1020 tray with a bunch of dowels screwed onto it. So you can imagine it's just a bunch of pencils screwed in the right spot. Because especially when we're transplanting out in the field, it takes a while to pop the plants and make sure they're loose. So just like you're saying, it can be nice to make some template like that so you can pop the whole tray on and get going.
Mm-hmm. Well, those are different than our tray poppers, because we have a bunch of different tray poppers, different sizes for different cells. This is for more of the individual, like taking the tomato plant out of the cell and sticking it into the new one.
Got it.
So, all right, let's talk a little about hardening off, because obviously if we've got a transplant, we don't want to kill it before we get it in the ground.
Yeah.
When we do get it in the ground.
Yeah. So hardening off, you can imagine. My wife wakes up every morning, and I say, "Oh, hey, dear, I love you," and she says, "Don't talk to me. I'm hardening off." And what hardening off is, I think it's the same that she's doing, is you're changing from one environment, in her case, a nice warm bed to starting your day, to another environment, or in our case, a greenhouse to the field. And so, just like living things everywhere, we want to make that transition gradual and not really quickly. Worst case scenario, if we don't harden off, we can have transplants die in the field. But even if you don't harden off and you say, oh, everything's fine, they look okay, watch those plants in terms of their vigor, because what you'll see when you don't harden off plants, they're just going to sit there for a week or a week and a half before they start growing. And now we were just talking about the advantage of transplants in outcompeting weeds. If you pop a transplant in the ground that just sits there for a week and a half, you're starting to lose that size advantage. So anyway, just to point to the importance of hardening off. The big properties that we think about with hardening off, probably first is temperature. That's going to be a huge change out in the field. And the other one is water. So a nice practice that I've seen growers do is using wagons, like big hay wagons. Or you could use a trailer of any size, I suppose, or a garden cart, whatever you want, and putting those transplants on the wagon outside during the day and back inside at night. And so you see how we're making things gradual. So at night when it gets colder, we're still giving them protection, but during the day we're giving them full sun, which they've never had because it was diffused through greenhouse plastic. And then later in that hardening off period, we can put them outside the whole time. And then the other thing we're doing is we're withholding water a little bit so that they harden off and get a little stockier and don't have that expectation of moisture all the time.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah, we always tend to have an issue, and I don't know if it's just the soil temp, and it may be just our soil temp in our greenhouses. We move tomatoes out of the nice warm transplant house into the new greenhouse, and they just tend to sit there and sit there. And I think it could be the temps we don't have a way to bring the temps down in the transplant house because we only have one zone in there, and we don't have a place to harden those off before they go out into the new world of the new greenhouse.
Right. Yeah, and this is, it's really fun visiting farms that have been in operation for 10, 20, 50 years because farmers just slowly and collect all sorts of things, but one thing they collect is different growing environments. And so
Mm-hmm.
people might have a house that's unheated, that's only for hardening off, but it takes a while to get there.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. All right. So let's talk a little bit about transplant into the field, and then we'll wrap this up because obviously we've hardened the plant off. It's ready to go out. Kind of what's your kind of thoughts on site preparation and transplant techniques?
Sure. Maybe one of the biggest things I think of is soil tilth. What can be really bad for transplants is going into a cloddy soil with a lot of residue. People sometimes call residue trash, but I think that's disrespectful to everything residue can do for our soil. Um, so just to say, residue is fantastic for soil, and of course, soil health. We don't want to break down all of our aggregates, but the big danger is even if we have good conditions, if we have large clods or lots of residue, what's going to happen is those roots are going to dry out. So we need good contact with the soil, and we want to establish the capillarity of the soil as soon as we can. So remember earlier on, we were talking about different size soil particles and how a germination mix has way smaller particles than a nursery mix because we want that capillarity. So same thing you'll notice on commercial transplanters, they have packing wheels. Because we want to settle that plant well with the soil. So the first thing I think about is soil preparation. And soil health is great, but when we're planting transplants, you want a nice fine tilth that those roots can grow into easily. So that's one thing. The other thing is preparing the soil deep enough. You want to plant that transplant at least at the same depth that it was before, if not a little bit deeper. And especially if you're using something like I like, those deep cell nursery trays or, a 4-inch tomato pot, that means you need to be able to get down there. So don't skimp on the tillage for quality transplants to take. The next thing is water. So a lot of growers, if they have a transplanting implement, they'll have a tank of water so that when each plant gets planted, it gets a shot of water. And I talked to a few growers who really appreciate that if they can transplant with just a little bit of water to the plant, even if they don't get rain for another, sometimes 2 weeks later, with that initial shot of water, that plant can get by without having to pull the irrigation reel out. So that's the next thing is whether you're irrigating right after transplanting or with transplanting, really make sure that happens. And then since we're applying water, oftentimes, hey, why not give it a little bump of fertility? And so a lot of people will add compost to their transplanting water or any or some other water soluble fertilizer, even if it's at a real low amount, just to stimulate those roots to grow. So we want to have good soil preparation in terms of good tilth. We want to have good depth. We want to set the transplant at the proper depth all the way down in the soil. And when you do that, it's cheating if you compress the roots. You want to put that full root ball all the way in and not compress it, because then you're going to get that nice root growth. Yeah.
So a lot of techniques there. And then, obviously getting that water directly afterwards, with that, you're talking about like a transplanting machine. You can dribble the water typically right into where the plant is. But if you can't do that, typically you just want to irrigate directly afterwards.
You got it. Yeah, whether that's drip or overhead, pretty much right afterwards. And again, your transplants might, survive for a while without being watered in, but they're not going to thrive. Your goal, whether it's a cedar transplant, is to put it in the ground and boom, have it take off and outcompete weeds.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, absolutely. All right. Well, I think that is pretty much the crux of it. We went from, selecting the seed all the way to getting into the ground. And I think the one important thing to talk about, if we started off by mentioning cultivation. If you are cultivating these plants, make sure you get these plants in the ground in nice straight rows, evenly spaced, so that you can get your mechanical cultivation down. And
you got it. Yeah, and one thing I love about mechanical cultivation is anyone can do it at any scale. And so even if you're with a wheel hoe, that's fine. All that matters then is you have straight rows. And maybe if you have a 5-row, fancy cultivator, great. Then you have to have them all evenly spaced. But just to say, whatever scale you're at, you can still set yourself up for success with weeding tools. But think about it at planting time.
Yeah, and I mean, even when we were first starting out, we would just take a simple string, run it across the field, pull it taut, and just plant right along the string. And that way, then that was very easy to cultivate, with that 1-row wheel hoe, or if you moved up to like a walking tractor or something like that, that makes that super easy.
You got it. Yeah, and there's all type of row markers, whether it's a rake, whether it's a rolling dibbler. So there's all type of ways to make sure you're getting the plants accurately spaced.
All right, cool. All right, so this upcoming field day in September, you said September 8th?
No, Wednesday, September 11th.
Wednesday, September 11th. Folks can, and that is in, you said Illinois?
No, we're at Purdue, Indiana. That's Lafayette, Indiana. And the field day will start right away at 9 in the morning, although people can come early for coffee and donuts and fellowship. But we'll start right away at 9 in the morning. And may I say a word or two about it? You can see how excited I get just talking about it.
Yes, go for it. Yes, go for it.
Thank you. We are going to have tools for all scales of farming there for weeding tools. And so first thing in the morning, people can go around and visit the trade show. There'll be companies there from all over the country. So you can see what's new with Japanese weeding tools or weeding robots or composting with black larva flies, all type of things. And then in the morning is our education sessions. And so this year, our theme is cultivation on the tillage spectrum, because there's a lot of different ways to control weeds as regards tillage. So we'll have Dr. Steve Myers from Purdue talking about his research with tarping. We will have a horse-powered plow demonstration, plowing under cover crops and the benefits that we get when we plow under green material. We'll also have demos of a French rollover plow and also of a speed disc and all the kind of talks around that. So that'll be the morning, the trade show and the educational sessions. Then we'll have lunch together, which is also always a great time just to meet growers from around the Midwest and around the country. And then the afternoon is the heart of the day, which is our field demos. And we've got all scales. We've got Johnny Seeds and some other people coming to show hand tools. We've got earth tools and small farm works, and I forget who else. Tillmore coming from Walk Behind Alley. They're going to show all manner of two-wheel tractors and two-wheel tools, paper pot transplanters, things like that. Then in the vegetable area, we've got Tillmore and Thiessen Tillage showing off all manner of cultivation tools for cultivation tractors, rear-mounted steel toolbars, edge of plastic, etc. And that'll be on direct-seeded beets and transplanted brassicas that were planted expressly for the field day for good conditions. And then we'll also have an entire row crop section. So these will be for larger growers. We'll be demoing 6-row machines, but in the field, these will go up to 24-row. And these will be camera-guided slide hitches. These will be rotary hoes, tine weeders. So that's the day for whatever scale you're at, whatever crop you're at. It's the place to be for cultivation. That's the Midwest Mechanical Weed Control Field Day. Just Google that, and our partner, The Land Connection, hosts our registration page.
All right, and that is September 11th in Indiana, correct?
Yes, September 11th, Purdue, right. Lafayette, Indiana. You got it.
Yeah, and that's actually that Purdue. I've been there. That's actually it's a really nice place. So I'm sure folks will really enjoy that. Again, there is something for everyone, and you will literally be taking videos and pictures the entire day because there's so much goodness going on there. If you struggle with weeds, or even if you feel like you're a good weed control person, but you want to up your game, I'm just amazed the last 10 years how far cultivation has come, And again, if you haven't seen these latest innovations, it's definitely worth it.
Yep, I agree.
All right, folks. Well, we are going to wrap this up. Again, appreciate Sam coming on today and really giving us a deep dive into all things transplants. And make sure you do check out you said the Land Connection is the website if they're interested in the field day?
Yeah, thelandconnection.org for Midwest Mechanical Weed Control Field Day.
All right. Well, again, thank you so much, Sam.
Thank you, Michael. Appreciate it.
Absolutely.
So there you have it, another episode in the books. So I'd love if you would hop on over to iTunes and leave us a rating and a review. Those mean everything to us. We love to hear what you're thinking. If you have a podcast guest that you can recommend, please pop on over to the Thriving Farmer Podcast website and leave us a review. That's thrivingfarmerpodcast.com.